Have you ever heard of an object capable of predicting the future, but only to announce the death of its next victim? Yes, it sounds like a horror movie script, but this story really happened, and it left a deep scar on those who dared to face the truth behind it. By the way, before diving into this mystery with me, have you subscribed to the channel? Check it out, subscribe, like, and comment, because it really helps keep this content alive and reach more people who love investigations like you. Most people believe the future is uncertain, that only God or fate can reveal it. But what if I told you that a simple, seemingly ordinary window was capable of predicting tragedies with frightening accuracy? This isn't just another urban legend, it's a case that blends criminal investigation, psychological phenomena, unexplained disappearances, and of course, the dark side of the paranormal. The most disturbing thing is that no one was safe. Anyone reflected in the glass had their days numbered, and the entire city lived for years in the shadow of this fear. And as if that weren't enough, recent records have reignited the controversy, showing that the window may still be active. In other words, perhaps the story isn't over, and the next reflection is about to appear. Today I'm going to take you on a journey through forgotten archives, the most chilling accounts, and discoveries that defy any logical explanation. But let me tell you right now, this isn't a story you'll forget easily. So take a deep breath, because what comes next could completely change the way you see the boundary between reality and the impossible. I remember the first time I heard about that house. It was as if the entire town breathed more softly at the mention of its name, almost afraid of awakening something dormant. Built in the late 19th century, its facade carried a silent weight, the kind you feel on your skin before you even touch the door. Curiously, the families who dared to live there never stayed long, as if something was pushing them out. I've always been intrigued by this, because places like this don't just tell stories, they hide them. I always say that spaces hold memories, and this house felt like a tightly locked chest. The most curious thing was how the architecture deviated from the common standards of the time, featuring strange angles and windows positioned in ways that almost deflect logic. It wasn't just a residence, it was an enigma of brick and glass. I've investigated prisons, sanatoriums, and even abandoned hotels, but this building gave me the feeling it wasn't built to house people, but rather secrets. The town's oldest residents had stories that repeated themselves like an uneasy echo. There was always something tragic about that house, a wedding that never happened, children who fell ill without explanation, businesses that suddenly failed. It seemed each generation paid a price for keeping that mansion standing. And strangely, no one dared demolish or renovate it, as if there were a silent pact not to touch what shouldn't be touched. It was at this point that I decided to begin investigating further. After all, if a place causes such a psychological impact simply by existing, imagine what it can reveal when observed up close. And the closer I got to that aging facade, the more I began to feel as if it wasn't the house I was investigating, but rather it was beginning to investigate me. And what I discovered next was even more disturbing. Few people knew his name, but among the city's old documents I found Alfredo Vascari, an eccentric architect who seemed more affinity for occult symbols than conventional engineering. His records showed incomplete notes, scribbles of gears, formulas, and even drawings of eyes scattered throughout the margins. He wasn't just a man who built houses, he was someone who sought to imprison ideas within walls. And in the case of this residence, he seemed to want to imprison time itself. What struck me most was his obsession with windows. In each project, the windows were not just openings for light and air, but central pieces, almost like observation portals. In the specific case of the house in question, the window in the main living room took up half the wall, framed in an almost ritualistic way. There was no practical sense to it. It was exaggeration, excess, whimsy, or perhaps an experiment. I've seen criminals leave signatures on their deeds, and apparently, the architect left his on the glass. Interviewing distant descendants of the Vascari family, I discovered that Alfredo had an almost unhealthy obsession with predicting disasters. Reports claimed he believed he could capture possible futures through geometric calculations and light reflections. Of course, everyone called him crazy until real accidents coincidentally happened exactly as he described. This sparked controversy. Was it just intuition? Or was he truly accessing something beyond common perception? The most disconcerting part was realizing how this obsession didn't die with him. His last drawings, found in a yellowed notebook, contained incomplete instructions about the window that reveals only the next soul. It was as if he were creating a selective, cruel mechanism with no room for error. And when I realized this, I knew I wasn't just looking at a bizarre architectural work, but at a legacy built to test the boundaries between life and death. The first witnesses appeared long before I set foot in the house. They were neighbors, simple people who had no interest in making up tall tales. They said that on certain nights, as they passed through the quiet street, they would see strange reflections in the front window. The disturbing detail was that these reflections didn't correspond to the present. One woman told me, with tears in her eyes, that she had seen her son playing in the backyard 2 days before he was actually there. Another account struck me deeply. A shopkeeper claimed to have seen, in his reflection, an injured man falling onto the sidewalk. Days later, the scene repeated itself in exactly the same way, at the same time, as if the glass had anticipated fate. When I heard this account, I confess I felt a chill run down my spine. I've investigated dozens of cases of mass hallucinations, but the precision of the details recounted by witnesses led me to rule out the hypothesis of pure imagination. However, not all residents were willing to talk about the matter. Many fell silent, changed the subject, or simply crossed the street when I brought up the investigation. The fear was so real that it seemed to shape the behavior of the entire community. It's curious to see how silence sometimes says more than any testimony. And that silence, in this case, seemed to scream that something was out of control. The deeper I delved into the accounts, the clearer a pattern became. The window didn't show trivialities of the future, but only events linked to tragedies or imminent deaths. It was as if the glass had its own agenda, choosing only what would bring pain and despair. And when I realized this, I realized that the mystery lay not only in what was seen, but in who would be seen next reflected there. Not long before I realized something many preferred to ignore. The window didn't show any random future, but always something linked to tragedy. This pattern was eerily consistent. Each reflection carried a grim warning, as if the glass had transformed into a cruel messenger, and most disturbingly, no matter the time or season, the window seemed to choose specific moments to reveal what was to come. I spoke with a former local watchman, who told me about nights he'd see unknown figures reflected there, only to later discover they were dead or missing. He spoke with teary eyes, as if each memory were an impossible weight to bear. Logic completely eluded any rational explanation. It wasn't a coincidence, or two, it was dozens of occurrences that fit together like pieces of a macabre puzzle. I spent weeks analyzing patterns, dates, times, moon phases, even local historical events. Nothing seemed to have a direct influence, but one constant recurred: the next victim always appeared in the glass, before their final destination. This realization chilled me from head to toe. I've been to crime scenes where the modus operandi was predictable, but I've never seen a witness as meticulous and silent as that glass. It was as if the window had a life of its own, an invisible criterion that decided who would be the next marked soul. And with each testimony, the feeling grew that we were dealing not just with an architectural anomaly, but with an entity operating through it. It was then that I realized, if the window was only showing the next victim, I needed to find out where this relentless selection was coming from before I ended up there myself. The first officially recorded victim was a 17-year-old boy named Miguel. According to reports, a neighbor saw his reflection in the window one ordinary afternoon, as if he were standing there, looking out. The problem was, Miguel wasn't home at the time. 3 days later, his body was found dead, lying on a nearby road. The circumstances of his death were never fully clarified, but the reflection had told the story before. When I delved into the police station's archives, I found brief, almost careless notes treating the tragedy as an accident. However, when I compared the times, I noticed the eerie synchronicity between the reflection seen and the destiny fulfilled. It was impossible not to notice that the glass seemed to function as a silent announcement, showing who was about to leave. It wasn't just strange, it was cruelly calculated. What caught my attention was the community's reaction. Many residents were shocked, but at the same time, they acted as if confirming a long-held belief. It was as if everyone already knew, deep down, that this window was unusual, simply waiting for the moment when it would claim another life. Miguel's death was not only the loss of a promising young man, it was also the consolidation of a collective fear. From then on, each new reflection became a sentence. When someone appeared in the glass, there was no celebration, no joy. There was silence, murmured prayers, and closed doors. Miguel's case officially inaugurated what would later become a succession of tragedies that I would have to investigate. And honestly, that was just the tip of the iceberg of what was to come. When the police were first called, they dismissed it as mere coincidence. In the reports, I read expressions like fatality and isolated event, as if Miguel's life had been just another number in a weightless statistic. The problem is that, soon after his death, new reports began to emerge. People described repercussions that didn't correspond to the present, always followed by imminent tragedies. It didn't take long for the coincidences to become a pattern impossible to ignore. I spoke with one of the first investigators to visit the house. He told me that, at the time, he didn't want to believe the residents' stories because he was afraid of losing his career by being associated with superstition. And I understand that. I've seen many professionals avoid delving into strange cases because the truth can sometimes be more costly than ignorance. But still, there was something in his gaze that revealed he knew it wasn't just collective paranoia. The most interesting thing was seeing how the police reports themselves began to contradict each other. There were pages of detailed witness descriptions, and then cold notes reducing it all to popular delusion. This internal conflict was palpable, as if the justice system was torn between facing the impossible or closing the case to avoid damaging its credibility. The result? No concrete action was taken. While officials closed their eyes to what they couldn't explain, the window continued to show the future of the next victims. The authorities' silence only increased the population's fear and strengthened the feeling that something uncontrollable was on the loose. It was at that point that I realized, if I wanted to uncover the truth, I would need to go beyond the official documents and follow the trails no one dared to investigate. With the accumulation of tragedies and community pressure, the city government eventually made a drastic decision to close off the house. Officially, the reason was structural risk. But anyone familiar with the story knew this was merely a cover-up to cover up the real problem. No trespassing signs were posted, windows were boarded up, and the front door was sealed shut. It was as if the entire city wanted to imprison fear within those walls. But do you know what happens when people try to hide something instead of confronting it? The mystery only grows. And that's exactly what I noticed when I interviewed neighbors. Many said that, even after the closure, they still saw strange reflections in the windows, as if the wood were unable to block the phenomenon. Others swore they heard knocking and footsteps coming from inside, especially in the early hours of the morning. The silence of the street became an invitation to imagination, or perhaps to something more real. The curious detail is that the more they tried to keep people away from the house, the more it became a point of attraction for onlookers. Young people dared each other to pass in front of the facade, as if it were a ritual of courage. Some even managed to enter through the side, and fear spread with each barely whispered story. The closure, ironically, only increased the place's dark reputation. It became clear to me that trying to silence history was futile. You can cover a window, but you can't cover what it represents. And what was about to happen in the following years would only reinforce this feeling that the house couldn't be controlled by decrees or wooden planks. Something inside insisted on speaking out. Not long before some residents, driven by fear and anger, attempted to destroy the window, hammers, stones, and even incendiary cocktails were thrown at the glass. The result? Nothing. The glass remained intact, as if made of a material that didn't belong in this world. I've seen old photos showing the burn marks on the wall, but the window shone clean, as if it had laughed at the attempt to erase it. This absurd resistance fueled even more speculation. Some believed the architect had used a revolutionary technique, others argued it was pure witchcraft. I'm usually skeptical, but I must admit that, upon closer inspection, there was something different about that surface. It wasn't reflective like ordinary glass. Light seemed to pass through it in a strange way, distorting the faces of those who approached. It was uncomfortable, as if we were seeing a version of ourselves we didn't want to face. One day, a group of city-hired workers tried to rip out the entire window with heavy tools. What happened was disturbing. The metal frame of the equipment shattered before the glass even scratched. The men immediately gave up, vowing never to return. And I understand them. There are things that defy logic, and messing with them is like poking a sleeping beast. You never know when it will awaken. With each failed attempt, the window seemed to reinforce its aura of power. The more they persisted in destroying it, the more the belief grew that something supernatural lay within. It was as if it were protected by an invisible force, determined to keep the cycle of tragedies alive. And it was in this climate of powerlessness that new stories began to emerge, revealing the psychological impact the glass had on those who dared to stare at it for too long. As I interviewed people who stared at the window closely, I realized that reflections weren't the only problem. Many reported intense symptoms, such as anxiety attacks, palpitations, and even fainting. Others said that after looking at the glass, they began to repeatedly dream about death, sometimes their own, sometimes of loved ones. This psychological pattern caught my attention because it wasn't just a collective fear. There was something specific happening to those who had prolonged eye contact. One of the most striking accounts came from a young woman named Elisa. She said that after seeing her cousin reflected in the window, she spent weeks waking up in the middle of the night, hearing voices calling her name. Her descriptions were so detailed that it felt like she was living in two worlds at once. As an investigator, I've encountered victims of severe trauma, but that look of exhaustion on Elisa's face showed that this went beyond the psychological realm. I've also heard stories of people who developed sudden phobias after looking out the window. A man who worked in construction, for example, reported that he could never go near glass or mirrors again. He said he felt as if he were always being watched from the other side. This kind of reaction made me reflect on how certain phenomena, real or not, can leave permanent marks on the human mind. And the scariest thing is that the more I gathered testimonies, the clearer one disturbing detail became. The dreams and voices weren't random. They seemed to act as a warning, an echo of what was about to happen. It was at that moment that I realized that the window not only showed images, but also infiltrated people's psyches, stirring them in ways science couldn't yet explain. Among so many stories, there was one that always intrigued me, that of a retired police officer named Roberto Lincheres. He called himself a staunch skeptic, the kind who believed in nothing beyond what he could touch. He decided on his own to visit the house and prove it was all just superstition. His colleagues said he walked into the main room, laughing, stared straight at the window, and even mocked the rumors. The problem is, days later, everyone stopped laughing. Roberto was found dead under mysterious circumstances. His body was in his own home, showing no signs of violence, as if he had simply ceased to exist. The detail that shocked everyone was that some neighbors claimed to have seen him reflected in the window days before, exactly as had happened with other victims. It was impossible not to connect the dots. His death was a severe blow to the credibility of those still trying to explain everything logically. What caught my attention most, however, was what I found in a notebook among Roberto's belongings. It contained notes about the visit, descriptions of the discomfort he felt when looking at the glass, and even scribbles of strange symbols he swore he saw reflected there. It no longer sounded like the speech of a skeptic. It sounded like the account of someone who realized too late that something bigger was going on. This case marked the transition from a phase of disbelief to one of collective fear. If even the most resilient investigator fell before the window, who else would have the courage to doubt? It was at this point that I understood that my investigation would not only focus on the facts, but also on the impact the window had on the minds of those who dared to confront it. And what I discovered soon after only increased my unease. On one of my visits to the municipal library, I came across a dusty box, forgotten among old documents. Inside were some diaries belonging to the architect Alfredo Vascari. The pages were yellowed, covered in jumbled notes, scribbles of strange symbols, and sentences interrupted midway. It was as if he had written in a hurry, trying to capture thoughts before they escaped. I soon realized that these notebooks were not mere records, but key pieces to understanding the origin of the mystery. As I read, a sense of unease grew within me. Alfredo spoke of his obsession with the reflection of tomorrow and described the window as an eye that never closes. In several passages, he cited geometric calculations mixed with occult references, as if fusing science and magic into a single experiment. Most intriguing was the constant repetition of one phrase, "The next soul cannot escape." These words echoed in my mind for days. Some pages were even more disturbing. There were accounts of vivid dreams in which he saw people dying exactly as they appeared, reflected in the glass. He noted times, dates, and even the manner of death. Interestingly, I found records that coincided with tragedies of the time, such as fires and local accidents. The question that haunted me was, did he actually foresee these events, or in some way provoke them? Holding those diaries gave me the strange feeling of touching a secret that should never have been revealed. I'd read criminal confessions, psychopath reports, and even suicide notes, but nothing compared to this level of lucid insanity. And yet, the notebooks didn't offer complete answers, only new enigmas. Little did I know that the content revealed there would only be the beginning of a series of even more disturbing theories. Vascari's diaries with some occult experts, I heard explanations that went far beyond common logic. They argued that the window was not just an architectural object, but a portal, a point of convergence between present and future, accessible only through reflection. The peculiarity, however, was cruel. The glass didn't reveal the fate of everyone, but only that of the next victim, as if it had a selective hunger. These experts told me about ancient rituals that used reflective surfaces to predict events. Mirrors, lakes, and even polished metals served as divination tools in different cultures. What Vascari had done, they said, was perfect as practice to the extreme, creating a window that filtered reflections to reveal the inevitable. I, who had always treated such things with skepticism, had to admit that the pattern was too frightening to dismiss. During a meeting, one of the occultists said something to me that I've never forgotten. This window doesn't show the future, it demands it. His theory was that the glass not only predicted deaths, but also sealed the victim's fate by displaying them. In other words, the act of appearing in the reflection was already the final sentence. This idea kept me awake for several nights, because it opened the door to something much darker, the possibility that the window was active, not passive. And it was precisely this perspective that changed the way I began to view the case. Until then, I'd seen the window as a kind of silent witness, a cold observer. But if the experts were right, then we were dealing with an agent interfering in the course of events. And this raised a disturbing question. To what extent is fate inevitable when someone or something seems to play with the rules of time? Despite all the paranormal theories, I also encountered psychiatric professionals who analyzed the case from a different angle. They believed that the reflections in the window were actually the result of hallucinations induced by collective fear. The human mind, when subjected to intense stress, can create images as vivid as reality. In this sense, the window acted as a catalyst. It didn't actually show anything, but rather provoked people to project their greatest fears. A psychiatrist I interviewed told me about the so-called nocebo effect. This is when the negative expectation of something bad generates real symptoms in the body and mind. Thus, if a person truly believed that appearing at the window meant death, their body itself could succumb to illness, accidents, or even unconscious suicide. This explanation made sense in some cases, but it still didn't address the main issue, the precise synchrony between reflexes and documented deaths. Another point raised by these experts was mass hysteria. In small communities, rumors spread quickly and gain momentum over time. A simple account from one person can become a narrative shared by dozens, until it seems unquestionable. The window, therefore, would merely be a backdrop for the manifestation of collective fear. This line of reasoning explained part of the phenomenon, but left gaps impossible to fill. And it was precisely this tension between science and mystery that drew me even deeper into the case. Because if it were all just a psychological illusion, how could we explain the precise details seen before each tragedy? And at the same time, if it were something supernatural, why were the psychological symptoms so recurrent and patterned? It was as if the window sat at a point of intersection between two worlds, that of the mind and that of the inexplicable. As I reviewed city records, I noticed an even more disturbing pattern. Some of the people who claimed to have seen reflections in the window had simply disappeared. There were no bodies, no trace of escape. It was as if they had been erased from reality, leaving only emptiness behind. For an investigator, this is the kind of enigma that hurts more than death, because absence brings no answers, only questions that echo in the silence. I recall the case of a young man named Kao, who reported seeing a woman reflected in the window days before she died in a house fire. After giving his statement, Kao was never seen again. Family members filed a police report, and searches were conducted in the area, but no trace was found. It was as if the simple act of witnessing the window had made KO part of the mystery. These disappearances began to generate even more fear among the residents. Many avoided talking about the matter, afraid they would also disappear. I could see the gnawing doubt in their eyes. Could mentioning what they saw trigger their own disappearance? The psychological toll was devastating. It was as if the entire community were trapped in an invisible pact of silence. And it was at this point that I began to question myself. Did the window merely show the future? Or did it also select who would be allowed to survive? The disappearance of witnesses seemed to indicate that the phenomenon wasn't limited to revealing tragedies, but also to erasing those who dared expose their existence. This revelation made me understand that I was facing something much greater than a simple cursed object. In the 1990s, a group of young men decided to defy the urban legend and film the window. Armed with a handheld camera, they entered the house at night, laughing and mocking the collective fear. The video initially showed only dusty walls and broken furniture, but at one point, the lens captured something in the glass, a clear reflection of one of the young men, standing in the middle of the room, even though he was behind the camera. It was a scene that still gives me chills just remembering it. Most disturbingly, all the young people who participated in this recording died in different accidents in the following months. A hit and run, an unexplained fall, a case of domestic poisoning, and even a drowning in a swimming pool. Nothing directly connected the deaths except the video, and, as if that weren't enough, the tape mysteriously disappeared from the police station's files shortly after it was handed over. I was only able to access transcripts of the content, prepared by an investigator who described it frame by frame. The report spoke of image distortions, muffled voices in the background, and even electrical interference that suddenly turned off the camera. Technical details that, to me, reinforced the idea that the phenomenon was not merely visual, but directly affected the environment. It was as if the window refused to be recorded. This episode profoundly affected the city. Afterward, any attempt to capture the window in photos or videos was prohibited by local authorities. Officially, they claimed it was a risk of trespassing and historical preservation, but in practice, everyone knew it was fear. Fear of what else might be captured, and most importantly, fear of who would be the next to appear reflected in the lens. Over time, the window case attracted not only curious people and investigators, but also scholars from various fields. Local universities began to debate whether it could be explained by physics, psychology, or even metaphysics. Some argued that it was simply a trick of light combined with collective imagination, while others maintained that it was a legitimate paranormal phenomenon. The discussions reached academic conferences, always generating heated debates. I remember participating in a roundtable discussion where physicists and parapsychologists nearly jumped out of their seats to argue. The former claimed it was all just a game of reflexes and optical illusion. The latter insisted that the repetition of the fatal events linked to the window could not be ignored. Sitting there, I realized that more than a search for the truth, there was a clash of egos, as if each side wanted to claim ownership of the mystery. What made it all even more fascinating was the amount of contradictory data. While some studies ruled out any anomaly, others presented intriguing results, such as unexplained temperature variations inside the house and changes in the heart rates of volunteers who stared at the glass. It was impossible to reach a definitive conclusion. The case divided brilliant minds, but united them all in one certainty: something unusual was happening there. Ultimately, this academic controversy only heightened the aura of the window, because when even experts disagree, what's left for those living in the shadow of the phenomenon? For me, each inconclusive theory was like another layer of fog covering the enigma, and it was in this landscape of doubts and conflicting certainties that new attempts to resolve the issue began to emerge, this time through spiritual practices and purification rituals. Faced with the failure of scientific explanations, the town ended up turning to the oldest path: the spiritual. Priests, mediums, and occultists were called upon at different times to try to purify the house, and especially the window. Masses were held inside the building, prayers chanted in Latin, and even smudging rituals occupied every corner of the room. The population watched with hope, as if finally the curse could be lifted. But the window remained intact. The chants echoed, The smoke billowed, and yet the glass shone with the same coldness as ever. Some religious people said they felt a suffocating presence as they approached, as if something were mocking their prayers. Others reported having sudden visions of people who would die days later. With each failed attempt, the feeling grew that it wasn't faith that was lacking, but rather that the phenomenon was beyond all doctrine. A medium I interviewed told me that during one of his sessions, he heard a clear voice coming from inside his own window. The message was short but devastating. "I choose." This phrase haunted me for entire nights because it seemed to confirm the hypothesis that glass not only revealed but also decided destinies. If this were true, we were dealing not with a cursed object, but with a conscious entity. These exorcism attempts only reinforced the population's fear. After all, if even faith, so powerful for so many, couldn't stop the phenomenon, what was left? It became clear to me that the mystery of the window couldn't be solved with holy water or prayers. And it was at this point that the accounts began to shift in tone, shifting from a spiritual battle to personal stories of victims who disappeared without a trace. Among so many cases, there was one that deeply marked the city's memory: the disappearance of Helena Duarte. She was a woman in her early 30s, known for her friendliness and her volunteer work. One night, a neighbor claimed to have seen her reflected in the window, standing still with a vacant stare, as if waiting for something. 3 days later, Helena disappeared without a trace, and to this day her body has never been found. The most frightening detail was that, before her disappearance, Helena had confided to friends that she constantly dreamed about her own death. She said she saw herself walking toward the window, unable to look away. This mixture of premonition and reality made her case even more disturbing. It was as if the window had infiltrated not only her image but also her innermost thoughts. The searches were intense. Rescue teams scoured forests, rivers, and even abandoned buildings. Helicopters and sniffer dogs yielded no results. The mystery consolidated like an open wound, a victim without a body, without a farewell, without an explanation. As an investigator, I can deal with death, but absolute disappearance is always the cruelest because it prevents any form of closure. And since Helena, there have been no more official records of victims, at least not documented ones. But the subsequent silence was never synonymous with peace. On the contrary, it spawned even more theories. Had the window ended its cycle, or was it simply waiting for the right moment to choose again? This doubt loomed over everyone like a shadow that never dissipates. Over the years, the house faded into oblivion, swallowed by the weeds and dust of collective memory. But silence never lasts forever. It was thanks to a group of urban explorers that the case resurfaced. They invaded the property, armed with flashlights and cell phones, determined to capture every detail. The video they posted online quickly went viral, reigniting the dormant panic. In the footage, the window can be seen covered in cracks from the surrounding walls, but still intact, shining as brightly as it did on the first day. Most disturbingly, at one point, the camera captures a reflection that doesn't correspond to anyone in the room. An indistinct figure, with their back turned, standing motionless. The group thought it was just a filming error, but I, after analyzing it frame by frame, realized there was something more to it. The immediate effect was devastating. The city, which was trying to move forward, was plunged back into fear. People began sharing the video with warning captions, warning people not to watch, as if seeing the reflection was enough to summon fate. The rumor spread across social media, and soon experts, curious people, and legend hunters turned their attention to that window. What had been buried was resurfacing with full force. I myself received countless messages asking for my analysis, and upon revisiting the house, I realized the atmosphere seemed even heavier than before. Time had eroded the walls, but not the power of the glass. On the contrary, it seemed more alive than ever, as if it had been silently waiting for this moment of exposure. It was then that I understood the story was far from over. As I investigated recent videos and spoke with experts, an even darker hypothesis began to take shape. Perhaps the window wasn't just a reflection of the future, but a sort of mechanism that influenced fate. In other words, by showing someone's image, it wasn't predicting the tragedy, it was causing it. This possibility transformed the window from witness to active accomplice, and it changed everything about how I viewed the case. I found evidence that some events only occurred because the victim was alerted or disturbed by what they saw, as if the reflection were a psychological trap, luring people to their own demise. Think about how often we ourselves create what we fear, simply by believing too much in danger. This dynamic seemed to me present in every death, in every disappearance. The glass not only revealed, it guided the steps to the outcome. The most disturbing thing was realizing that the latest video suggested a new pattern. Not just specific people appeared reflected, but even entire groups. It was as if the window had expanded its reach, seeking not just individuals, but anyone who dared approach. This change in behavior put me on high alert. If the phenomenon had been uncontrollable before, now it seemed poised to become a collective threat. And it was at this point that I found myself faced with a difficult choice: continue investigating, risking being swallowed by the reflection, or step away and let the window fulfill its dark cycle alone. But the truth is, I can't stop, because each new clue makes me feel like the story isn't over, just waiting for the next chapter, and maybe, just maybe, the next name to be reflected will be mine. After reading this story, I ask you, what would you do if you found a window that showed the future, but only to reveal your own death? Would you dare to look? Or would you prefer to live in ignorance, believing that tomorrow is still open? These questions aren't just about the case. They also speak to how we face our own fears and choices in life. Many live as if fate were inevitable, but perhaps the real prison lies within our minds, fueled by the beliefs we accept without question. Have you ever failed to act in some area of your life because you believed too much in a negative reflex? How many opportunities have slipped away because you convinced yourself the worst would happen? I want you to think about this carefully, because just like the reflections in this window, we too create distorted versions of our future, and sometimes we end up attracting exactly what we fear most. So tell me in the comments, do you face your fears head-on, or do you prefer to look away? This answer may reveal much more about you than you imagine. And of course, if this investigation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can continue following stories that will challenge your assumptions, provoke deep reflection, and who knows, change the way you see life. The next mystery is already on my list, and I want you to join me on this journey.